Most people who grew up in my church spent years having to explain one thing over and over again. No, I'm not Mormon. And honestly, after a while, it was just easier to say nothing at all. My family has been in the Community of Christ Church for 4 generations. The Community of Christ Church was known for most of its history as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And to settle any confusion at the beginning, no, we are not Mormon. But the majority of people never understood that because of the name or the shared history with Joseph Smith. My great-grandmother apparently met missionaries from the church in Missouri where she lived and was so inspired by them, which led other family members of further generations having priesthood roles in the church and being very active. Now that I've said we're not Mormon, I should actually explain what the church is and why almost no one has ever heard of it. I'll keep it short because this is a personal story, not a documentary or a history lesson, but it's super important for the background for people who have never heard of Community of Christ, and honestly, even for Mormons who don't know anything about this part of their history. Community of Christ has its roots in the same place as the LDS Church, the Church of Christ that Joseph Smith first organized in 1830. After Joseph Smith was killed in 1844, the movement split into several groups, each claiming to be the true continuation of his work. The largest group followed Brigham Young to Utah and became what we call the Church of Jesus Christ or Latter-day Saints, or colloquially known as Mormon, although the church is now moving away from that term. The branch that became the Community of Christ chose to stay in the Midwest, and it eventually reorganized in 1860 in Amboy, Illinois under Joseph Smith III, Joseph Smith's eldest surviving son. This group came to be known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS Church, and it saw itself as the continuation of the original church rather than the rebuilt-in Utah version. For a long time, it was a moderate Midwest wing of the Latter-day Saints movement with a strong emphasis on rejecting plural marriage and creating a more familiar Protestant-style Christianity. In 2001, the church changed its name to Community of Christ to make it clear that it was not just a Mormon splinter group, but it had its own distinct Christian denomination with a focus on community, Christ, and peace. Today, it still traces its origin back to Joseph Smith, but it no longer claims to be the only true church in the way that the LDS Church does. Instead, it presents itself as one expression of a universal Christian community, and now it's even one of the most progressive branches of the whole Latter-day Saint family. The Community of Christ still uses the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants, just like the LDS Church, but there are major key differences. The theology is closer to mainline Protestant Christianity. It accepts a more traditional understanding of the Trinity. It doesn't teach the kind of divine exaltation or plan of salvation that the LDS Church does. And it has moved away from the idea of being the one true church in favor of a more inclusive view that many different faiths can be valid pathways to God. On the ground level, that translates into clear differences from the LDS Church. Community of Christ has long opposed polygamy, and in the 20th century, it became one of the first Restoration-adjacent churches to ordain women to the priesthood. In the 2000s, it went even further and began fully including LGBTQ+ people performing same-sex marriages and allowing gay and lesbian members to be ordained, something the LDS Church still does not allow. It also rejects the idea that only one church on earth holds the fullness of truth and one legitimate priesthood, instead emphasizing that God works through many traditions and communities. So when people hear Community of Christ, they're hearing about a church that shares early history with Mormonism, but then took a very different path, away from Utah-style restoration, away from strict exclusivity, and towards a more open and progressive form of Christianity. That's why, even though I grew up in a church that was once seen as another version of Mormonism, the people I sat with in Georgia were actually worshiping in a tradition that had already began to distance itself from a lot of what most people associate with the LDS Church. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in the church in which there were a few small congregations in the Atlanta area, but I did realize from a young age growing up in the South that we were definitely a minority. Most of my friends and neighbors were mainstream Christian, whether that was Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, Catholic, or yeah, perhaps even Jewish. Members of my dad's family were also mixed Protestant, and my dad attended with my mother when I was young until they divorced, but my mom continued raising me in the Community of Christ Church. I didn't really know many differences between us and more mainstream Protestantism because, honestly, if you attend a Community of Christ service, you probably couldn't even really tell the difference. And at some point that I don't remember, I realized that members carried around these big scriptures that contain the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants all bound together in one large book. But I really don't think that in all my years growing up in the church, the Book of Mormon was ever mentioned during a church service, ever. Now, I think my church congregation specifically was a bit more on the side of distancing themselves from church history during services in order to attract new members, but I can't speak to what happened during adult Sunday school lessons or how other congregations really handled the subject. Perhaps in Sunday school they did talk about the Book of Mormon, I don't know. I certainly know many congregations, like for example, where my grandmother still attends, are significantly older and people might be more traditional or live out the denomination differently. But honestly, the Bible, the mainstream concept of the Trinity, and what felt like a pretty standard Protestant doctrine were the driving force of my congregation. I liked our church really as a child, having attended other Protestant services with family members over the years, because the Community of Christ Church has a large focus on singing, personal testimony, and they typically had different priesthood members speaking every Sunday, including many women, and it was just a lot more interesting, dynamic, spiritual, and personal. Many other churches to me just felt so stale, so formal, boring, lacking some kind of spirituality, and they were all focused more on a single pastor. Going to church camp was a big part of my life every summer, and we typically went to campgrounds with other children from Community of Christ congregations elsewhere around Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So a mix of other kids I saw every Sunday, but also kids I saw at least once a year. So there was always this feeling of community with other congregations. I think what is typical for a Community of Christ that I haven't heard from many other denominations is what is called reunion, which is basically family camp. This normally happened in the summer in some areas. I went to other reunions in some places like Illinois with my family, but my mom and I went every year with my congregation during Labor Day weekend in the US. So what's important to take away from this is that we really knew our congregation and spent time with them outside of church. The name says it enough. The Community of Christ is really about community, and I saw so many true acts of kindness, fellowship, really just like pure love. Whereas when I visited other Christian churches, it felt more like going to see and be seen. It was more impersonal or just kind of lacking any type of spirit or dynamic and seemed too traditional and stale, at least for me as a child. I know these things are a bit more boring to children. But also one of the other Atlanta area congregations where my aunt and uncle were leaders of in the Community of Christ Church was called the Contemporary Congregation. And my mom and I would go there a few times a year. It was about a 50-minute drive from where we lived, and it was just comprised of maybe like 10 families. They met in an office park, but most of the service was really like praise music, people standing, like lifting their hands up, closing their eyes, like perhaps even dancing, feeling really like moved by the spirit. They played contemporary Christian music before contemporary Christian music was ever a mainstream thing. And we went to a reunion or like this family camp with their congregation group one time. And I remember it so distinctly. I was 5 years old, and yeah, there was like this service where like people were really into it, and it was like very spiritual. And I saw two girls. It was so weird. They were like on opposite sides of the room, and they just fell down at the same time and started like convulsing, and they were speaking in tongues. So I don't really know what to make of that entirely because it was the only time I saw something like that, but I just want to highlight that the community of Christ has a broad spectrum. There are many congregations that just want to sing like the traditional hymns and have a sermon, and then those like really being led by the Spirit and more like on the mystical side, I would say. My congregation was definitely in the middle. We really started the service with praise music. It was like more modern, contemporary kind of music. Some people kind of did this, but most didn't. And then there was like hymns and that kind of thing during the rest of the service, or someone might sing a solo, play a piece of music, that sort of thing. So fast forward to me being 11 years old, I decided that I wanted to go to private school after having gone to public school for elementary. And it was at a non-denominational Christian school in the area that was very competitive for academics with other private schools in Atlanta. And it slanted about 80% Protestant and 20% Catholic. And I remember being primarily accepted, but there was still an interview phase before full acceptance. And my mother had a serious conversation with me and said that I needed to not mention anything about the Book of Mormon or being RLDS, not because she was ashamed by any means, but because mainstream Christians just do not understand who we are and would confuse us with Mormons, as commonly happened when people hear about the RLDS Church. And it would risk me not getting into the school or me having problems once being there. I did, however, understand where she was coming from, and I knew the gravity of the situation because even at 11 years old, I had enough experience with being a member while growing up in the Bible Belt of the US. And I don't know, I still didn't know too many specific differences between us and other Christian denominations, other than like we had the Book of Mormon as a secondary scripture, but it didn't play a huge part. And I would later learn as I continued to grow up, and especially at my school, having entire courses on the Bible where there were some differences, but I understood where my mom was coming from, and I knew that I needed to try and keep my mouth shut because I didn't want anyone to think that I was incorrectly a Mormon. And I was really able to do this from 6th until 12th grade. Other than actually quite early on in my 6th grade Bible class, I think because the whole situation was just new to me and a bit overwhelming, because I had a Bible teacher, I believe he was like a devout Calvinist, and he was obsessed with knowing which student was in which denomination, whether that was Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, etc. And we went around one time in the class, and when I was asked, I just replied Community of Christ, but no one reacted, no one seemed to know what that was. And I think that was also somewhat shielded because it's also important to note that my mom and I at some point started going to like maybe once a month to like a larger non-denominational church in the Atlanta area called Church of the Apostles, which is quite well known. And there were a lot of other students at my school that also went there, and like they knew that I went there from time to time. I was a little bit active in their youth program. So I thought that maybe my classmates just thought I was non-denominational or something. There was, of course, no reason for them to expect that Community of Christ meant RLDS. So back to this Bible teacher, he was, of course, very anti-Mormon. And I had like this side conversation with him one time in class where I basically came forth and said that like my church had split away from the Mormon church at one point, but that we essentially rejected all of the doctrine, and that was it. I went on my whole schooling journey kind of just coming off as non-denominational or mainstream Protestant, but continued going to the Community of Christ Church regularly, church camp every year, and being a really active member. And I was okay with that because, like I said, I felt a part of this great community with truly the most caring, loving, nicest people you will have ever met. My mom, unfortunately, had a lot of health problems when I was growing up, and like people would drive her to medical appointments. They would invite us to Thanksgiving when we weren't otherwise visiting family. when people needed help in the congregation, whether it was like when they were having babies or surgeries, I don't know, not being able to pay their rent, just needing any kind of help, the congregation and the church truly provided, even financially. And sometimes when we went to like this other mainstream mega church, the clientele was like mostly rich Atlanta families. Although their youth program had more to offer compared to my congregation, and it did a good job of providing a needed third space for youth. One other story I have about not wanting to be associated with Mormonism was at church camp. My cabin was having this evening lesson, and I brought one of my good friends from school for the week with me. And one of the other boys was talking and like kind of told his testimony a bit. And he said that he was inspired by Joseph Smith and like the struggles that he went through. But like this was just a really quick mention, and I'm not even 100% sure if my friend even heard it or would have like understood it through the context. But I remember like my friend eventually had like gone to bed with a couple other people, and I came out of like the room and went to the other boys and the counselor and basically said like, please don't talk about Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon. He won't understand. He might tell other people or whatever. And that was a moment of shame for me because it was like always kind of this dirty little secret that we had. But it was honestly scary to think that if somehow it got out, people would think that I was Mormon. And I want to emphasize for viewers that either didn't grow up religious or perhaps grew up Mormon themselves and don't have the outside context, but the mainstream Christian church does not consider Mormons Christian. And I remember I was in Boy Scouts, it was at a Baptist church, and we one time went to like the Sunday school lesson where they literally said that Joseph Smith was a false prophet, and they were talking a lot of like anti-Mormon rhetoric. And I know plenty of Mormons might consider themselves Christian because they believe in the Bible or some other teachings and that sort of thing. But I've studied Mormon doctrine in great detail recently, and their concept of God is just so different that you can't really compare the two. So the fact that this view is held by so many people that I surrounded myself with at school and in the community, I just did not want to be associated with the LDS Church and have people think that I wasn't a Christian or somehow think poorly of me. And at some point, maybe when I was around 15 or 16 years old, we ended up having a Sunday school series for my Sunday school age group in which we learned about Joseph Smith, his revelations, how the Book of Mormon was written. Important side note, how the Book of Mormon was written is different from the Mormon story about this, what the Community of Christ Church teaches, and some other initial teachings about the Book of Mormon stories, such as learning about Nephi or Moroni. And at the time, it was actually kind of exciting in a way because it was like told from this lens, less about like this book is actual scripture and more about it being another testament of Christ and that Christ visited the Americas and that the story of the Bible is actually a lot bigger than people have made it out to be. And it didn't seem so strange to me that when Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that he could have, I don't know, potentially visited other people in his time before ascending into heaven. And it was also kind of like spun in this way to make it seem that America is also God's chosen land and that us being such a Christian nation was somehow God's plan. So for me, being a young American at the time, there was like also this American pride somehow like also thrown into it. And lastly, through the revelations of Joseph Smith and later prophets of the church, in the third scripture, we have the Doctrine and Covenants. The Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants is a bit different than the Mormon Doctrine and Covenants, but essentially we have the scripture because the idea is that God never stopped talking to and revealing himself to humans with Jesus, and that still continues to this day. The difference being that in Mormonism, that revelation and the prophet of the church is seen and lived in a completely different way compared to the Community of Christ Church, where new scripture is more about the direction in which the church is going, as opposed to it being like actual scriptural doctrine. The last story I'll tell about my experience in the church, which is essentially my last major encounter I ever had in the church before I became inactive during my years in university, is that I was actually called to be in the priesthood and was called to be the role of deacon, which I ended up accepting after some contemplation and uncertainty. So a deacon is more of a minor role in the priesthood and really has a lot to do with service. So whether setting up the church building in the morning and after the service, to preparing the bread and grape juice for communion, also like collecting the money collections and tithing during the service, kind of like passing around this plate and people would put their money in there. It was about volunteering to the logistics and operation of the church building and the service. And so many deacons end up being called to higher priesthood roles in their lifetime later, but also many stay as deacons and live out that pure service role as opposed to later providing more of a doctrinal or spiritual role as a priest, elder, 70, or other priesthood members that they're called in the church. It's important to note that women have been ordained priesthood members in the RLDS Church since the 1980s, with my aunt having been one of the first in the whole country, something that actually did cause people to leave the church back then. But that is something that is a huge distinguishing factor between the Community of Christ and the LDS Church, where women are still banned from the priesthood and women just overall are treated like second-class citizens in almost all aspects of the religion. So for me, this role felt good at the time because I had already donated a lot of my time to the church through volunteer work, participating in services, whether doing religious skits, singing a lot as a child, or just being a more devout member than some of my other peers my age. But on the other hand, my calling to the role felt very strange at the time. The way it went down is that the pastor of the church said he wanted to speak to me and basically arranged that after a church service, I would meet him and another high priesthood member in their quarters. And I had no idea what this meeting was going to be about. So me being about 16, 17 years old, I was like, of course, nervous and thought I might be in trouble for some reason that I didn't know. And I was like really nervous at the beginning. And I mean, I was like standing across these two men in their 50s and they were like in these suits, and then just me sitting across, and I really respected them. And it just started with them like giving me a lot of praise for who I am, my character, my service to the church, that the congregation really looked to me as like a very smart and wise person despite my age. And essentially that they saw the love of Jesus shine through me through the way I carried myself throughout life. And I know this might sound a little woo-woo for people who didn't grow up religious, but these were the types of things that were said to me often growing up because I was a really good kid who never got in trouble, and I was always very mature for my age. And then at some point I was just thinking like, where is this going? And then they finally came out and said that I was being called to the role of deacon, and that this is a role that the Spirit, basically through the power of discernment that they had, was a calling for me. And essentially that was the beginning of my journey in the priesthood in the church. And I was actually kind of relieved when they told me this, because I at least knew it was like going in a positive direction despite not having any idea why they had called me into their office. But afterwards, like I felt really confused and also a bit weirded out, I suppose. But I was excited because like I felt a bit special, I guess. But I quickly felt immense pressure, considering that this was a call from God. And yeah, even though He chose me and this is my calling, and the church actually teaches that all are called to serve and to be disciples of Christ. That's something that the Community of Christ really pushes, like all are called. But it still nevertheless just felt so much to me at once. And I remember telling my mom, I was like, I don't think I can do this. I feel unworthy. And it's perhaps worth noting, and if you know anything about my story on this YouTube channel, but fast forward to now, I am married to a man and have a son. So I could do an entire video about how difficult it was to discover that I was gay while being in the church, especially at my Christian school where it was against the rules to be gay. You could be kicked out for it. This happened to my friend that came out as lesbian. And I just spent so many nights praying the gay away, being confused, being scared of, I don't know, hell, feeling sinful or dirty, to wondering why would God create me this way if he loved me? To eventually then coming to like some kind of acceptance while still in high school, but not actually having a full coming out until after high school graduation and just living as a gay man when I started in college in New York City. But all of that was always going on in the background during my childhood and religious experience. So there was just another added layer of feeling confused or unworthy when being called to the priesthood. But I eventually accepted the call and was ordained as a deacon and spent a year or two maybe afterwards before going off to college doing those duties, something that I learned more and more about and was quite keen to be involved in was like setting up the sound system for the church service, like setting up the microphone, speakers and that sort of thing. My church also did a lot of like volunteer work. So like I was still quite engaged with the church and enjoyed being a deacon, but then I kind of like went off to university and that's when things really started to change. So really the process of accepting that I was gay was the beginning of my religious deconstruction already when I was about 16 years old. Instances where I thought, why would God create me this way if being gay is such a bad thing? It was certainly not a choice. And that was a big narrative in the US back then. I would have chosen being straight any other day when I was younger. I dealt with bullying in school because I was into things like theater, pop stars, female actresses, and was just like overall a more empathetic and sensitive child. Through my theater obsession, which back then was a huge escape for me from my everyday life, where I could live out my more true self, I discovered theater message boards where there were more people like me, and I was quickly confronted with people who were accepting of everyone. And there were so many allies, and of course also gay people themselves. Whereas at the time, I had no real gay role models in my life. I was for the first time in my life confronted with ideas that I held to be true about God or organized religion or whatever it was. And I even had people call me out. And I realized for the first time that the only reason why I held certain beliefs and never once questioned them was because I had just been spoon-fed my entire life what to believe. Luckily, not in a fundamentalist way. There were certainly friends that I had and grew up with having a very strict Christian upbringing, very strict families. So I luckily didn't have that, but I still questioned so much of what I had been taught my whole life about the nature of God. Why would a gay child like me be so condemned while so many other people out there who call themselves Christians are like actually really horrible people? Through that, from hearing from other people who struggled just as I did, I realized that there was nothing wrong with me and God loved me just the way I am. I realized that people pick and choose what they want to believe from the Bible or Christianity, but then completely ignore so many other verses that somehow don't align with their worldview or somehow justify them in another way, like the violent nature of God in the Old Testament, instances of genocide, slavery, and other contradictions all throughout the Bible. Being raised in the community of Christ Church gave me a completely different perspective about Christianity, doctrine, God, about everything really. My denomination on the outside might have been seen as cult-like Mormonism, but people I grew up with in the community of Christ Church are truly some of the most loving, caring, peaceful people I have ever met. Whereas so many other people I knew who called themselves Christian were just going to church to check a box or socialize with other prominent people or use it as some kind of cloak for their bad behavior or whatever it might have been, or why people go to church. But this disrupted my whole idea about what mainstream Christianity and their narratives tried to push. And that disillusioned me so much, and it left such a bad taste in my mouth. I started meeting people in the theater or later in college who were Jewish, atheist, or some other kind of religion, and they also had morals and values, and I learned that those things don't have to be tied to religion, and that doctrine and church teachings, no matter what religion, can actually be very harmful and damaging to a lot of people. I saw so many good and powerful things growing up in the church, but I was also harmed, and especially some people that I knew. I learned that I could have my own spiritual practice that wasn't tied to going to church every Sunday. Even though I did try a few times in college, probably some kind of guilt that I felt. I attended a Christian group a few times at my school, and I also went to like some random church by myself on an Easter Sunday in New York City, but like I felt nothing. I realized that I would never be able to find my home congregation in the community of Christ Church anywhere else. And those great memories and spiritual experiences that I had were genuine experiences that I had at the time. And those were tied to a community, spirituality, family, and tradition, and not to specific doctrines or belief systems. And even if I had continued living in that community, the congregation ended up dying out quite a bit. And I was certainly also a different person and in a completely different place in my life after having come out and living in New York City. And going back to that small congregation in Georgia was just also never going to be the same either. My time in religion definitely served as purpose in my upbringing, but I quickly grew out of it once my circumstances changed and I became an independent adult. I realized that I could be a good person, have morals, have a spiritual practice, and could leave behind all of the baggage and doctrines tied to truth claims in religion. I realized that our evolutionary brains have created God ever since we became smart enough to know that we were going to die. Every point of human history has had some sort of spiritual or later religious practice, and our concepts of God are always changing and evolving, especially adapting to shared cultural and historical experiences as people. I went through a period of about 10 to 15 years where I didn't think much about religion, even though I was still always sort of slowly deconstructing religion. But it wasn't until actually the show came out, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, that I suddenly, for the first time, went on these rabbit holes, especially about Mormonism. And even though I knew some stuff about Mormonism growing up, it was actually still quite foreign to me, despite everything that I mentioned in this video and the historical ties. For example, when I was young, my mom and I toured the outside of a Mormon temple in Hawaii, which was gorgeous. And she kind of made some snarky comments about Mormons to me and asked some questions to the Mormon missionary leading the tour. So I kind of knew some things like baptisms for the dead or sealings, marriages for all of time and eternity. But oh my God, I went down every rabbit hole you can imagine about Mormonism while watching The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. I've just seen so many hours of evidence about how Joseph Smith was a con man and a predator, how he manipulated and threatened the people around him, how the Book of Mormon was completely fabricated, and even how some aspects of the Community of Christ Church, which is still aligning with mainstream Protestantism, still had troubling connections to the past that I read recently. They themselves are even having a hard time kind of gripping with. Massive shout out to Alyssa Grenfell on YouTube, the Mormon Stories podcast, and No Nonsense Spirituality by Brett Hartley on YouTube for helping me with this deconstruction journey and for helping me to begin to create my own path in this life. My journey to become a father forced me so much to think about what kind of father I want to be, what are the best and worst parts of myself, and what do I want to shed or bring to the table? And how can I show up in my life and be the best version of myself that I can? I also did some soul searching during our surrogacy journey, and a big part of that, ever since the COVID pandemic, was examining my life and figuring out what serves me and what doesn't. I quit a horrible job. I now have a job that I really enjoy. I went through some longer periods of sobriety from alcohol, realizing that that didn't serve me, partying didn't serve me. Also, I tried legal psychedelics to help heal some other childhood traumas that I had, thereby also learning about kind of like my place in the world, becoming more self-aware, feeling more connected to everything in the universe, and really just like feeling more present in my life, dissolving the ego, developing how I can bring presence and being into my everyday life, all of those sort of things, to just developing during the pandemic kind of like a yoga and meditation practice that I still carry with me. I developed a deep connection with my dog and gave up other things in my life that no longer serve me. I did suddenly, through all of that, then cling to like spiritual phenomenon like near-death experiences, NDEs, things like mediumship, and perhaps other new age spiritual beliefs, listening to all sorts of like podcasts and that sort of thing. And it gave me some comfort about death and a potential afterlife, being with your family after death. But I realized more and more that this jump to other spiritual or religious beliefs is a natural thing for the brain to do when we as people deconstruct religion. Our evolutionary brains have developed a way to deal with our fear of death and giving objective claims to spiritual experiences. And I'm now in a place in my life where I try to experience those subjective experiences just for what they are and not attach any greater meaning to them. And I've developed a spiritual practice that helps me feel centered, calm, balanced, and connected without needing to like hold on to any dogma or rigid belief. I can appreciate all aspects of religion. I can experience traditions and shared myths. Where I live in Bavaria, even though I was never a true fan of Catholicism, I see the importance of community, tradition, and shared myths and what that does. I find like-minded people and share in communal experiences at places like music festivals, concerts, or yoga classes. I think finding a community outside of religion can definitely be a huge challenge. And of course, being a part of religion can almost give you all of those benefits. And there are certainly plenty of people who are part of religious communities that maybe do not fully believe. I think that was actually something so special about growing up in the community of Christ Church. We didn't necessarily perhaps believe or understand all of the original church history or what we share with aspects of Mormonism, but it was a community of people that truly made the denomination special. They took something back then and made it into something truly remarkable, setting the way for women in the priesthood, ordaining queer people into the priesthood, and performing gay marriage. Truly living their lives in such a special way through the love of Jesus, of actually helping their neighbors and the less fortunate. Whereas in Atlanta, where I grew up, church for so many affluent members of society is just about social circles and status symbols and not about the community. I'm definitely thankful for growing up in the church because it made me an extremely empathetic person. It allowed me to have a spiritual practice from a young age, whether through journaling, music, art, serving others, giving of my time to something that truly mattered. Whereas I feel like so many people give their time to religion for a purpose that does not matter. I am not perfect by any means, but I do feel like my life is very intentional and that my intents come from a genuine good place. Whereas so many people in this world are like zombies and do things without any consideration for others or think about how their actions might affect others. Religion is so helpful for so many people to understand how they experience this situation we are in as humans and in this universe. And there are so many beautiful aspects and teachings about religion. And if that truly gives you happiness and allows you to navigate life in a way that works for you, like that's amazing. Most people never question their faith. In fact, when communities are threatened, people tend to become more fundamental in their beliefs as a survival mechanism. But I have learned that I can create meaning and purpose from the ground up instead of from the top down. And I can have my own subjective experiences, and that those things don't need to be tied to truth claims created by someone else to make that happen. I absolutely still feel awe and wonder when I walk into an old cathedral here in Germany. I still get chills when I hear a choir on Christmas Eve. I still take parables and messages from the church to heart. But those feelings and emotions that I feel are not equated with knowing objective truth. Some more thoughts about being gay in the church. I want to emphasize that while I struggled with being gay, was confused about my feelings, and didn't have role models for those who were like me in the real world, there were some in the theater, but I didn't know how to experience things like sexual awakening and puberty in a way that centered around and catered to gay youth. Abstinence-only education was the only thing preached at my school, and my school really shoved purity culture down our throats and made it seem like losing your virginity before marriage was like a sin next to murder, and that it would ruin your whole life and your future marriage. And these things really took a toll on me growing up, but on the other hand, I never felt these sorts of pressures from the Community of Christ Church. I think this is due to a couple of different things. Community of Christ members really love the person and meet them where they are. So many people I knew gave testimonies of mistakes they made, and I never felt like they were judged. At summer camps, we would have like the sharing hour towards the end of the week where we formed a circle and people went one by one into the middle and kind of like shared what was on their minds and on their heart. And some people really revealed a lot of like tough things that they were going through. And I remember I was like always one of the first people to like go give that person a hug if they started crying, or like put my hands on them if they received prayer from priesthood members. That's something that both in Mormonism and Community of Christ, like the laying on of hands, prayers of healing, that sort of thing. Community of Christ culture is about sharing what is on your heart and realizing that we all have struggled, and just supporting the person and being there for them was what they needed. They didn't need any judgment, a slap on the wrist, or some other kind of punishment. Also, due to this sharing culture, things like journaling, self-reflection, I must say there's also a completely different type of man and masculinity in the Community of Christ Church, something I hardly ever saw when I attended other churches. Men were more humble, meek, sensitive, willing to show emotions. It was completely normal to see men cry when sharing something or giving testimony. We need more of that in the world. I think any Christian denomination already attracts gay men to the priesthood because it's an opportunity for the in-the-closet men to stay in the closet. No one questions their sexuality if they are working for the church. And I actually see this primarily in the Catholic Church here in Bavaria. And I actually know a gay man who works directly in the church. And not to say that anything that I just say regarding emotional vulnerability or sensitivity equates with being gay, not at all. But what I mean is that the Community of Christ Church normalized men showing emotions, being vulnerable, and breaking this mold of toxic masculinity. And people then didn't put labels on that. And it's also interesting because I feel like people that I went to camp with during the summer, like a lot of them ended up coming out, especially as bisexual, men and women. So it just goes to show how many youth seeking church are actually on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, and how we need to foster an inclusive environment for youth. And that is just so important. I mean, look at the LDS Church today, where the suicide epidemic of youth is so rampant. So while in school, I was being bullied for being more feminine, sensitive, whatever. In my church, no one blinked an eye. So I didn't have fears at all about being gay in the Community of Christ Church. It was more about my schooling and upbringing in Southern mainstream Christian culture. And now the Community of Christ Church is fully accepting of LGBTQ plus people, ordains them into the priesthood, and even allows gay marriage. That is just so affirming and makes me proud to know that I was raised in such a progressive church. Now, the decision was made around the time that gay marriage was made legal throughout all of the United States. And at the time, I was actually already living in Germany and I had been inactive in the church. But I heard that my home congregation actually did suffer because of that policy change. Many prominent and long-standing families left the church because of that policy. In any group, you have a range of fundamentalism. And looking back, I would say that those families that left were actually the ones who leaned more towards fundamental aspects of the denomination. For example, the woman that taught me about the Book of Mormon, she left. So it's interesting because today, obviously, the LDS Church still fosters policies that are incredibly damaging to LGBTQ plus people. So that wasn't totally absent from Community of Christ either. I think this policy shift towards being so progressive and open towards all people has truly cemented Community of Christ's legacy and was yet another way in which the church tried to swiftly move away from its Mormon history. But unfortunately, these shifts are starting to hurt the church because it has isolated core generational members, and churches, everywhere are grappling with declining numbers. And given that the church has problems growing anyways due to its Mormon history, I think the Community of Christ Church has never recovered from that afterwards in terms of membership and church attendance. And especially now in the post-COVID world we live in, those numbers are even worse. For example, my mother and her age attends a local non-denominational church in her community just because the drive to our Community of Christ location is just too far away for her. That being said, I wish that those looking for an inclusive religious community would discover the Community of Christ Church, because the church has so much potential to create a new destiny, but it will still always be haunted by its shared Mormon past, which just unfortunately scares off new members or people interested in joining. I will say the church never hides its past or doctrines. However, it also certainly does not just come right out and say them during the first few times that someone might attend the church. Whereas the LDS Church, there are so many historical aspects and doctrines of the church that long-standing members even don't know about or know the full truth about, for example, the second anointing. Even though I'm no longer religious, I'm still deeply grateful for what the Community of Christ Church gave me: a sense of community, a language for spirituality, a space to feel safe, and a place that treated me with compassion instead of fear. It allowed me to feel like I belonged long before I understood queerness or adulthood or parenthood even. That matters. I'm also grateful that the church made room for women, that it eventually opened its doors to LGBTQ plus people, and that it tried to live out a version of Christianity that is more about serving neighbors than about policing them. That's the kind of religion I can respect even as I walk away from believing in it. I don't call myself religious anymore. I do feel like I've perhaps become a spiritual atheist, or spiritual but not religious, you could say. Someone who experiences wonder, awe, connection, and meaning without needing to anchor it to any set of official doctrines, prophets, or sacred texts. I can feel sacred in a choir, a cathedral, a yoga class, a dog's gaze, a starry night, or even a rainbow family dinner here in Bavaria. I don't need to pretend that those feelings tell me something objectively true about the universe. I just let them be real in the moment without over-explaining them. And that's a place where I'm at now. I still feel awe, I still feel connected, I still feel reverence. But I no longer feel the need to hand that reference over to a denomination, a prophet, or celestial hierarchy. I can build it myself in my own way, in my own life, in my own family, in my own relationship with death, nature, and time. All of this also feeds into how we're raising our son and what we're trying to build as a family. My husband Martin grew up Catholic and still deeply values many Catholic traditions and attitudes about life, especially the ones that are tied into Bavarian culture. He doesn't hold on to the truth claims of the church, but he still respects the rhythm of holidays, the sense of community, and the way certain rituals mark the year. We thought a lot about this with the birth of our son, how we would raise him, whether we would do things like potentially having him baptized or whatnot. Our parents have asked us about this. But when it comes to the Catholic Church, that's not really a realistic or honest option for gay men who are openly married and building a family like we are. The church's stance on same-sex relationships is fundamentally at odds with who we are and what we want to model our son. We don't want to expose him to an institution that would implicitly or explicitly judge our family, especially when our LGBTQ+ identity is such an important part of our family identity. At the same time, we still want to raise him with strong morals, values, and a sense of shared traditions and myths. There are still so many Catholic public holidays in Bavaria, like Ascension Day, Pentecost, the Day of the Holy Three Kings, Maria Himmelfahrt, and all the rest. And they're so deeply ingrained into Bavarian life and history that you just simply cannot escape them. He's going to inherit this cultural background, whether he likes it or not, and we'll have to explain to him one day what they mean and why they exist. So instead of pretending those traditions are ours to own in a religious sense, we want to adapt them in a way that fits our family. We're thinking about things like having a short Sunday lesson of our own, maybe a short reading, a short talk, or a short video that sparks a conversation about values, empathy, and responsibility. Building family rituals around games, nature, music, or art, going out into the forest, visiting a church just to admire the architecture and the choir, attending a musical or an opera together, or even just having a weekly board game night where we talk about what we learned from the week. Using the structure of those Catholic holidays to teach him about history, community, and how humans have always tried to find meaning. This day used to be about X, but for us it can be about Y. We want to give him a sense of purpose and direction without tying it into rigid dogma. We want him to feel part of something bigger, a community, a family, a culture, but also feel free to question, explore, and create his own beliefs as he grows. We see a lot of Gen Z boys and men right now searching for exactly this. Their parents, Gen X, and many millennials were often raised in a context of disillusionment with religion, and they didn't systematically replace religious practice with alternative moral structures, community, or shared rituals. That's left a generation of young men who feel directionless, who are looking for rites of passage, for mentors, and for a sense of belonging, but who don't have a clear cultural container for that. We don't want our son to be a part of that lost generation of men. We want to be intentional about creating something that can give him a sense of identity, responsibility, and connection. So in a way, my journey from being a deacon in the community of Christ through deconstructing Mormon-adjacent history to becoming a spiritual atheist has fed directly into our parenting philosophy. We're trying to keep the best parts, the community, the rituals, the sense of sacred time, the moral questions, and drop the rest. We want our son to grow up with a strong sense of empathy and compassion, the ability to question everything, including the people who raised him, and have a toolbox of rituals, stories, and traditions that help him feel grounded, even if he never walks into a church as a true believer. We're not trying to raise a religious child, we're trying to raise a whole human being who can navigate a world full of contradictions, myths, and beliefs with honesty, kindness, and self-awareness. So to anyone who grew up in a church that felt like home, or that felt like a prison, or that felt like both at the same time, I see you. To anyone who's still trying to reconcile being gay, being queer, being different with a religious upbringing, I see you. To anyone who's deconstructing, dismantling, or just slowly letting go, I see you. And if you've never heard of Community of Christ before, but you're curious about a church that tried to be progressive long before that was cool and still carries wounds and contradictions, welcome. You're not the only one with a complicated story. Thanks so much for watching. I know this has been a long video and a deeply personal one for me, but if you've made it this far, chances are you're also somewhere in the process of questioning, deconstructing, or reimagining what spirituality means for you. If you want to see what life looks like on the other side of all of this, as a two-dad family between Germany and America, figuring it out as we go, stick around. That's exactly what this channel is about: modern parenthood, rainbow family life, the kind of honesty, messy, thoughtful conversations that don't fit neatly into a church bulletin. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you don't miss more videos like this one. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being here. I'm Robert, and this has been a Papaarade story.